Well, thanks everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces for those of you who I know and for those of you whom I don't. I'm Jim Minow, the Executive Director of the Cure JM Foundation, and I'm delighted to have all of you with us tonight as we continue to expand our our families and our grassroots support around the country and really around the world. It's my role tonight is really a pretty simple one to introduce our speaker, Dr. Andrew Heaton. Dr. Heaton came to Cure JM a little over 2 years ago as our first Chief Scientific Officer, and I need to tell you that he's made just some extraordinary changes and progress in the way Cure JM goes about funding our research, and I think most importantly, developing really laser-like focus on the kinds of things that that this organization needs to achieve for our children, and he's going to tell us a little bit about some of that tonight. Andrew has really brought us to to the cusp of what I think of as the next big thing for Cure JM. And that is Cure JM's really providing the leadership to develop what will hopefully be several new drugs that will be available to JM patients and our JM children here very much within the foreseeable future, the next 2 to 3 years. He's also helped to expand our medical advisory board to one of global leadership. And in fact, it was that medical advisory board and our partnership with Duke Children's Hospital and Andrew's hard work that brought over 125 attendees from around the world to this symposium that we held on new drugs for juvenile myositis. So with that, it's my pleasure and my honor really to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Heaton, Chief Scientific Officer, Cure JM Foundation. Andrew.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks very much for the kind words of introduction. And I must say, this is the first time I've worked in a not-for-profit foundation. My background, as you can probably pick from the accent, is I'm originally from Australia. I've been living in the United States for a little over 7 years now. And really, my background is in the pharmaceutical industry, but I always had a passion for rare diseases and specifically rare pediatric diseases. So one of the things that I was trying to do in my pharmaceutical life was develop a drug for a very rare childhood cancer called DIPG, diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, which is a rare and fatal childhood brain cancer. So, I came to the foundation with that, what I thought was a passion for pediatric drug discovery until I came across Jim and the board of the Cure JM Foundation, and that's where I really understood what passion for new drugs for a rare disease is all about. So it's just wonderful to work with such an active, engaged board for the foundation that are really trying to drive from their first-hand knowledge of the disease, what can we do to help our kids and what can we do to try and get some new drugs into this rare disease that is often overlooked by big pharma and by so many organizations. So it was my pleasure really to generate this symposium. We were sort of thinking about what could we do in this time of COVID-19 when a lot of the regular meetings were cancelled due to COVID-19 restrictions, and what could we do to bring some of the best researchers around the world together to discuss, what's the current state of play with new drugs for JM. So I really do need to acknowledge, as Jim said, Duke Children's. We're fortunate that is one of our centres of excellence. It's led by 3 outstanding clinicians. So Dr. Jeffrey DeVergton actually runs the clinic there. Fantastic doctor. They've recently added Dr. Kaveh Ardalan, who was at one of our previous are at a previous center up in Lurie Children's up in Chicago. And the whole thing is run by Professor Anne Reed. Now, Anne is a key member of our medical advisory board. And the fact that I get so much time to discuss things with Anne, and the foundation gets her as a medical advisory board leader, is just outstanding. Anne is, you know, one of the world leaders in JM research, JM clinical trials, JM diagnostics. You know, she's one of the JM people that is seen as a go-to around the world. So I organised this symposium in collaboration with Duke Children's. As Jim said, we had over 120 different interested and engaged clinical doctors on the call that were really intrigued about what's happening with new drugs for JM. So it was a very successful symposium, and it's my pleasure tonight. We're going to have some time at the end of this for questions, but just to take you through what I think some of the highlights and really try and distill down what was very complex science into something that you can grasp and you can actually see where the trajectory is for drugs for juvenile myositis, which obviously we all have a very active interest in. So I just want to start with the who, why, and what. So the who is, we invited a bunch of key speakers from a mix of industry, so some industry folks that are interested in drugs for JM, research clinicians that are actively running clinical trials that are looking at potential new drugs for JM, and also treating physicians that treat our kids on a day-to-day basis about, you know, what their thoughts and opinions are on new drugs for JM. The why did we run this symposium? We basically identified a gap in how do we disseminate the information that we know that's happening in the clinical trials, because we're a great conduit of this information, but sometimes the clinical trial information gets a little bit lost amongst all the science that's actually going on. So we really wanted an avenue for us to really emphasize what's going on with clinical trials. The other thing that we really wanted to do as part of this information dissemination is a clinical trial, and I'll talk about clinical trials in a moment. A clinical trial, its utility is only fully realized once the trial has actually completed enrollment and you analyze the data. So if a clinical trial is still open, even though patients have been treated with the drug, we don't know exactly how good it is until they've finished recruitment. So we wanted to advertise which trials were still open, just so that if a doctor was treating a JM patient, they were aware of which trials were open, what the clinician was looking for potential trial kids, and then try and, you know, ensure that the trials were going to be pushed to completion so that we could actually realize the full value of the clinical trial and how useful they actually were. The what we wanted to do in the symposium was look at those clinical trials that have been completed. So, you know, what's been going on that is at a stage of, you know, completion or partial completion. Those clinical trials that were open but have not completed enrollment. And critically, when we're going to talk about this drug last, I think it's the real highlight for us as a foundation and for our kids. Those new drugs that are in development and offer significant potential in the future. So that's basically the background as far as what we were intending to do with the symposium. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's worthwhile just pointing out that, you know, to get a drug approved for JM, typically what has to happen is, you know, some basic research goes on to look at both cell lines and animal models of a disease to try and identify a drug that may be useful. You then go through the FDA through what's called the IND process to get the FDA's approval to actually run a clinical trial. And I'm sure we've all heard these words over the last few months with COVID-19. There are then 3 phases of a clinical study, which is basically, it's assessing first and foremost safety, which is done in phase 1 clinical studies, through to phase 3 clinical studies, which is assesses safety, side effects, and critically efficacy in large populations of patients. And once you've actually completed the 3 phases of a clinical trial, you can then apply to the FDA for a license to be able to utilize that drug in the population, as we're seeing has just happened today with some of the vaccines through the FDA. So as far as JM is concerned, we suffer a little bit from, it's a disease that is not a single disease, because there is such, I'm sure as you're all aware, there's such a spectrum that our kids present in, that there's no one good model you can use for JM, because it's not a single disease. So we suffer a little bit from not having great animal models. So what we've been tending to do predominantly is use drugs from existing autoimmune families of drugs that we know work in related autoimmune diseases, and we're now trying to, borrow some of those drugs and actually see if they've got any value in treating JM patients. So things like, methotrexate, I'm sure you're all aware of, is something that has been migrated from other diseases to JM. And then as far as formal approval is concerned, we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, but if we get some really good critical information on drugs that indicates they work in JM or a cohort of JM patients, and we get a publication on that, that is often enough for us to convince some of the other clinicians that this is a drug that they might like to think about trying in a specific patient if they present in a specific way. So these are eventually become what we call consensus treatment protocols, because I'm sure you're all aware that JM has no specific drugs that actually have a JM target or a JM license application. So the actual symposium that we ran on October 17th, we spent a little bit of time at the start dealing with a class of drugs called JAK-STAT inhibitors. We were extremely fortunate when we actually started this process to have some key folks from the NIH to get involved in this. So specifically, I want to call out Dr. John O'Shea. Dr. O'Shea is, he has got such a background in the JAK-STAT pathway that he actually, and his group actually discovered and named one of the JAKs. So he's a world leader in this specific area. And the JAK-STAT drugs are more and more every day becoming one of the mainstays of treatments from an autoimmune disease perspective. There are new ones that are coming up, not quite on a daily basis, but they're certainly coming through. So it was pleasing that we got Dr. Hannah Kim to talk about the JAK program that she looked at. We then looked at a few other drugs that are in clinical trials. I'm specifically going to call out the Baricitinib trial that Dr. Rodolfo Curiel has been running at our GW Center for Excellence. And then I'm going to finish it off with a drug called vamorolone, which is a steroid replacement, which is being developed by a small company called Refractory. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. That's not in a JM clinical trial yet, and it's the Foundation's fervent desire that we get this into a clinical trial as quickly as possible, and I'll describe exactly why we think that's so important towards the end of the talk. But just to highlight some of what was actually discussed during the symposium. So Dr. Hannah Kim, the Foundation has known Hannah for quite a number of years. Hannah is an absolute rock star as far as both clinical research, and now she's migrating to actually help out at our GW Center for Excellence. And she's based up at the NIH, and she was part of the critical team that did one of the first studies of Baricitinib. So Baricitinib is a drug that belongs to the classification of these JAK-STAT inhibitors. It's a drug that is on the market and has been utilized extensively for a number of autoimmune indications. Hannah did a lot of work with what she calls interferonopathies. So those autoimmune diseases that have an interferon signal associated with them. And the basic research that Hannah did prompted her to actually look at which drugs would actually be useful to treat JM. And that's how she came up with Baricitinib, this JAK-STAT inhibitor, as a potentially useful drug from a JM perspective. But you never know if a drug's actually going to work until you actually put it in a trial. So Hannah and the team at the NIH, they managed to convince Eli Lilly, the owner of the drug, to give them the drug for free so they could run the trial and just really determine how good it was with JM patients. So while it was only 4 patients that Hannah actually studied, I think the key thing here is the data that she's actually achieved on this specific drug. She's now actually published. So it was published earlier this year. So this is a graph that, this is the way scientists usually talk about how good or how bad a drug is. So I'm sure, as most of you are aware, some of the tests that we do when we're taking our kids to these clinics, things like, what's the muscle weakness like, and how can we actually try and put a score to that, because you can only manage what you can measure. So if a drug is having an effect, what effect is it having on muscle weakness? So they assessed a manual muscle testing. They also looked at scores, which we call CDASI, which is basically, it's an indicator of, the relative severity of skin disease. So that's the way that scientists, would typically present their data. But as they say, a picture paints 1,000 words, and these patients are all obviously de-identified. But Hannah presented this data just to indicate, some of the severity from a CDASI perspective that the patients turned up to the clinic with, and how quickly these really bad skin rashes, nail fault, capillary issues, how fast these did resolve and how well they did resolve. And it was interesting that Hannah presented this data on October 17th to our symposium. She then presented more updated data at the American College of Rheumatology conference a month later, and she had the slides from these 4 patients another few months on after they'd been on this JAK-STAT inhibitor, and the changes were as dramatic again. So this is clearly a drug that Hannah and the team at NIH, so specifically Dr. Lisa Ryder, who's the chair of our MAB and also has global standing within the JM community. Hannah and Lisa are very excited about this drug. They have been using it in their clinic, and they're sufficiently excited that even though this has been a small study that's completed, so they completed the analysis on 4 patients, what they'd really like to do now is enroll another 20 patients in a more expanded study, looking at patients that have got different myositis-specific autoantibodies, just to look at, from a precision medicine perspective, which patients are going to respond best to this particular JAK-STAT. So we're excited that this trial is being expanded, and certainly it seems to work. And as it does roll through and this trial does open up, we will certainly be advertising that fact on our website and communicating it to our broader base. So these JAK-STATs are really one of the drugs of the future. There's some newer, more specific JAK-STATs that are coming through, and we're actively involved with the NIH group at looking at which JAK-STATs, after Baricitinib, that we can actually look at testing. So some of you may have been made aware of, we fund a very dynamic group at what's called NCATS. It's a National Centre for Translational Studies. Dr. Travis Kinder, one of our research fellows there, he's doing some very great preliminary fundamental work on looking at the disease basically in a cell line that he's manufactured with CRISPR. And he's looking at which JAKs does he think may be better for JM. And we're going to use that to actually help inform, the next trial after Baricitinib. What's the next JAK that we should actually be trying with our JM patients? So really practicing what you would call precision medicine. The next trial I'd like to talk about is, again, at one of our other centres for excellence down at GW. This centre is run by Dr. Rodolfo Curiel, but Hannah Kim and Dr. Lisa Ryder are also intimately associated with this specific centre for excellence. And I'm sure Simonetta can fill us in on how wonderful this centre is and what they actually do for those really hard to treat, really hard to diagnose patients. It's like Dr. Ryder is just an absolute magician at, assessing patients, diagnosing them, and determining, what consensus treatment protocol is potentially going to work best for them. And they practice what they preach, and they're actively involved in studying a number of drugs, and specifically, not a JAK, this is a biologic that they've been studying, a drug called abatacept. And abatacept had been studied in adult DM patients and had quite a significant measure of success, to the extent where the GW group convinced BMS that actually owned this drug to broaden the scope of the study and include pediatric patients. So Dr. Curiel opened this study up. It's called the AID trial. And really what they're looking at is, again, those core set measures, things like, muscle score, the CDASI score, muscle inflammation and things like that. They're looking at how can we improve those specific scores and key biomarkers with abatacept. Now, this study has been open for quite a while, and it's one of those things where, because it's a clinical study and because it's being run in conjunction with a drug company, the data sets with these clinical trials are very, very securely locked. So nobody can actually get access to the full data set until the trial has actually finished. And unfortunately, the trial is a little way off being finished just yet. We need just one more patient to enroll in this. And once we've had one more patient enroll in it, the data can then be locked, and we will then be able to uncover exactly how beneficial this drug has been in our JM patients. So this is one of the trials that it's not finished, but it's about to be finished. And certainly, the anecdotal evidence that we receive from our patients that are seeing the clinicians at GW is that the drug certainly seems to be working, but we like to put some numbers on that. And then I think critically, once we've put some numbers on that and finished the clinical study, we're then in a position whereby it can get published. Other clinicians will see the potential benefit of the drug. They'll be able to speak to Dr. Lisa Ryder about, how we could utilize this in different cohorts of JM patients. And critically, once it's published, that makes getting insurance coverage on the drug so much easier. So again, we're excited about what's actually happening with this drug. The last thing I want to talk about is I can remember when I was being interviewed by Jim and others at the foundation. They were talking almost in hushed tones about the potential of this drug vamorolone. And it's only when I actually joined the foundation and really saw what was happening firsthand to some of the kids when they were first diagnosed with JM. I'm sure all of you are aware that the consensus treatment protocols, when our kids are turning up and when they're suffering really badly, it's like, how can we actually treat them with some drugs that are going to help them and try and get them back, get some of their really severe symptoms under control. So by and large, the consensus treatment protocols we have for JM is that they go on corticosteroids. So prednisone, either in pulse mode or in high dose mode, and eventually get weaned off it. And I'm sure that you've all seen the really horrendous side effects of the steroids, you know, so the weight gain, some of the mood swing issues, you know, it's stunting of growth. There are so many adverse effects. I mean, corticosteroids, they're renowned from a medical discovery perspective as the folks that discovered these got the fastest Nobel Prize in history. It's like, you know, they were discovered one year, they got the Nobel Prize almost a year later. They're extremely powerful drugs. The reason they're so powerful is your standard corticosteroid affects something like 10% of the proteins that every cell produces. So it modulates 10% of the pathways in every cell. So you get a bit of good, but you also get a little bit of bad, which is, you know, this is why it's such a powerful drug, and it really does help bring some of those inflammatory responses down very quickly. The side effects are, you know, really severe and something that we want to try and minimize. And this is why I think this drug is so exciting for our patients. It's a drug that came out of Binghamton University up in New York. Again, this was very close to our medical advisory board, and I think it really demonstrates the depth and the brilliance that we've got in our medical advisory board, where Raju, as he's affectionately known, is the guy that designed this drug up at Binghamton and started it down the pathway, and Eric Hoffman, who's the VP of R&D at Refractory, has taken it into the clinic. And this drug has now been in the clinic for quite a period of time, specifically focusing on Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and looking at controlling the inflammatory responses associated with DMD. So it is a drug that has been in the clinic. This slide basically just, you know, really demonstrates all the adverse side effects that you get when you take these normal steroids. And these are something that we really would like to try and minimize with any future steroids. So Raju was very successful in making a relatively small modification to this drug, made this small modification to the drug, and actually found that it no longer affected the full 10% of the pathways associated with your cell. And it was fantastic in that what it did do is it affected those particular pathways associated with an inflammatory response, where it did dampen down those specific pathways. Those pathways associated with the negative effects of steroids, it actually did not stimulate those pathways. I think it was 3 or 4-fold less from that stimulation perspective with those pathways. So this, you know, this is one of those drugs that it really is like a unicorn. It's got just as good an activity as our standard corticosteroids, but it's got none of the side effects, or certainly the side effects are greatly diminished. It's been in several hundred kids already. Because Duchenne's is what we call a SNP disease, so it's a single nucleotide polymorphism that's just associated with males. So it's just linked to one specific chromosome from a male perspective, that it hasn't been utilized as much in a female population because DMD is a male-only population, but it has been demonstrated to be extremely safe. Not only has it been extremely safe, the side effects, so Eric has got all sorts of great data on mood disturbances are much less, there's no stunting of growth, there's no delay of puberty, Kids sleep better. The body mass index doesn't increase at anything like the rate of what a normal corticosteroid actually does. So this is, as I said, this is one of those drugs that we really would like to take to the next step. And I really just want to summarize some of what Eric presented at our symposium, which is basically, as I said, it's been into 121 boys in a double-blind registration study. So the hope is with this specific drug is that it's actually going to be approved late next year for Duchenne's. And I think probably most of you would be aware is once a drug is actually approved, there is then the potential for it to be used what we call off-label. So off-label away from Duchenne's. So what the foundation is now doing, and again, this has really been a fantastic team effort. And what we've done is we've looked at what could we demonstrate from a biomarker perspective in JM that would indicate that this drug is going to be useful. So we've done that. We did that back in 2018. That was great background work, but it's now about, as this drug is getting closer and closer to registration, I think, you know, you can probably pick up my enthusiasm for this drug. This is something that, you know, we live and breathe every day, and it never goes fast enough for us. But we're now looking actively at how can we actually take this drug into a JM trial. And again, I'm really fortunate here to work with, you know, some fantastic folks. So first of all, we've got Dr. Eric Hoffman at Refractory that is actively engaged with us and really wants to see this drug to be expanded beyond Duchenne's kids and really sees the value that it could bring to the table with a bunch of other autoimmune diseases, specifically JM. And we've really been, we've been trying to be a bee in his ear, but in the best way possible to try and indicate to him that we'd like to do everything that we can to ensure that the next bunch of patients that this drug goes into are JM patients, because we all know the negative effects of the corticosteroids. So I've got Eric on board with, you know, we want to run a JM trial. Then obviously to run a trial in a drug like this, you actually need to get the appropriate team together. And I've been fortunate here whereby I got the team at Duke Children's. So, you know, Professor Anne Reed, Dr. Jeffrey DeVergton, and Dr. Kaveh Ardalan are roaring and ready to go with this drug. They've been actively involved with myself and Eric and somebody called the Duke Clinical Research Institute at actually planning as to how could we actually take this to the FDA and ask them for permission to start a JDM clinical trial. There has been some feedback from the FDA to Refractory as far as, you know, how they would go about starting a clinical trial. They went with ulcerative colitis as a potential second indication, and the FDA said you need to do a little bit more work in certain areas. We've taken cognizance of that, and we're at the stage with the Duke team that on the 17th, I think I'm on the phone to them. We're hopeful of getting something to the FDA, hopefully by the end of this year, if not the end of this year, certainly very early next year, whereby we'll ask the FDA for, we'll ask them a bunch of questions about the drug. We'll indicate the issues with the disease. We'll indicate the issues with the current standard of care. And we'll ask them for feedback on what we would like to do as far as a JM trial is concerned. And we're hopeful, because we've got the right team together, that we're going to put forward a submission to the FDA that's going to meet with their approval. They will then hopefully give us the green flag that we can then go ahead and start this clinical trial. And I think, you know, this is one of those things whereby unfortunately, clinical trials cost money. And, if we had the money, available early next year to actually start this trial, if we got the FDA to actually approve what we would like to do, then this is something that, personally I have a passion for, but, I know the foundation and the board and so many of our families, they speak to me on such a regular basis about when's the vamorolone trial opening up, when can I get my kid into it. They've changed so much since they've been on steroids that it's something we maintain a passion for, but it's all about, getting the right people in place. But then, the critical thing to actually get this clinical trial running is some money to actually get it driving forward. So this is one of the drugs that it's not in clinical trials yet. We know it's got a great deal of potential for JM, and it's now about how do we get this trial progressing and really light a fire under it. So it's something that has such great potential. And I just wanted to emphasize that as a foundation, Jim and I have got a lot of personal and emotional energy tied up with getting this drug into our JM kids as quickly as we possibly can, with your help and with, the help of so many, generous donors that actually donate to the foundation that actually allow us to do these studies. So this is something that the foundation brought me on board for. So I think, as Jim said, it's now really a matter of we've got the key parts in place. Once we get the FDA's tick of approval that, yes, you've got a protocol that we think is a viable protocol to start in JDM kids, then, we wouldn't even like to waste a week before we would actually open up this trial and get it going. So there's a lot of, I just wanted to emphasize that we had so many great talks at the symposium, and there's so many good drugs that we're already starting to see data on that are going to offer benefits to some of your grandkids. But again, we're going to open this up for questions shortly, but I'm sure you would appreciate that so many of you would have had a first-hand experience with steroids, and I can almost guarantee that the first-hand experience was not a fantastic one. So bringing something like this along would be something that would be a game changer and a true disruptor as far as consensus treatment protocols for JM. So that really sort of wraps up what we gave and what we had happen at the symposium. Our intention is to probably run another one of these again next year at some stage. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize is, quite often you have so many of these meetings and it's like everybody comes to a meeting, gets fired up and goes, oh, that's a great idea, that's fantastic. Then they go away from the meeting and nothing happens. So I think the thing that was really pleasing here is that we got the right team of people together with the right amount of energy that, we had this meeting on October 17th. We're now not even the 17th of December. And, we've got the team of people together that are about to put a submission to the FDA. So I think that really does indicate, the energy, vitality, and the enthusiasm, both the foundation and key members of our medical advisory board have for this drug. So it was great to see, the symposium not just be, a one-stop shop at the train station, then everybody sort of left and nothing happened. So something is happening and it's continuing to happen. And as it does progress, we will keep everybody updated. But that's probably enough from me. And at this stage, I am more than happy to open it up for questions, comments, etc. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I just want to, we'll throw it open for any questions that we might have from the floor. Please just unmute yourself and speak up.
Hi, have any trials been done in just steroid sparing where you can start with that on patients already on So that, have any studies been done to be able to taper the dose, reduce them from
Do you mean with this steroid that I've been talking about?
the one you're talking about?
So they have been using it in Duchenne's kids, as I said, for a number of years, but it hasn't been into other autoimmune diseases yet. So it's only been used in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which is, a young male specific disease. So the intention is, the way that we're planning the study is, we really see this drug as a drug of the future, whereby we would like to move completely away from corticosteroids and move into vamorolone. So the way we're going to structure the trial is there's going to be 2 doses. So, you're probably aware that, so many kids come in and they're initially on high dose steroids. Then as their symptoms decrease, they get some level of management and they can go onto the steroid sparing drugs. You then go into, lower dose regimes of steroids. So the way that we're going to plan this clinical trial is to actually facilitate going to lower dose of steroids and to facilitate going into steroid sparing regimes.
How do you decide which children go into these clinical trials?
So any clinical trial always has what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria, and this is what we're doing very carefully with the aid of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. One of the things that we are almost certain the FDA will make us do is, because the FDA is always safety first, because it hasn't been used in an autoimmune disease like this. They tend to like people using a drug in an adult population first. So probably what we will do is our trial will have a number of cohorts, and we might enroll 10 patients that are adults that potentially have JM, so they're over 18. They may have been on steroids before, they've been off them, but they've got a flare, and we're trying to bring a flare under control, and they may come onto steroids like that. We are hopeful that we also may be able to get some freshly diagnosed patients, but the critical thing here will be that we have adult males and females, so we generate safety data in males and females. We'll then immediately migrate to our JM kids, and that's where we're going to be looking at enrollment criteria are typically age-related. There'll be a minimum weight criteria. As I said, we're hopeful that we will be able to include both kids that have got a flare, so they may have been on a steroid before, but they've been off the steroids for a while and they've got a flare, whereby a doctor would typically prescribe, even if it's maybe a low-dose steroid, to bring the flare under control. So we're hopeful of enrolling both those sorts of patients and potentially newly diagnosed patients. But the issue you always face with the FDA when you're asking the FDA for approval to go into a clinical trial like this is, if there is a good treatment that's on the market already with corticosteroids that so many doctors use, they tend to be reticent to completely swap that out for newly diagnosed patients. So this is the fine line that we're going to have to tread. It may mean we have multiple cohorts. So we have 10 adults, then we have 10 kids that are potentially flaring patients. Once we establish flaring patients, that the drug is well behaved in our pediatric cohorts of kids, we could then potentially go to 10 kids that have got, are freshly diagnosed and they've never seen a steroid before. So it's going to be a balancing act as to how we actually do it. And we're keen to get a trial that's effective enough that we can get data out so that lots of doctors can start to use it quickly so it becomes available to the broader community. But we're also conscious that we want enough data that, yes, you can use it in a flare, yes, you can use it in a freshly diagnosed patient. So it's a balancing act. There's a long answer to the question, sorry.
Oh, no, that's good. I wanted the information. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, okay, now say it.
Is this a completely novel drug, or are there other JAK-STAT drugs that you mentioned that?
So the JAK-STATs are a different class of drug, And there, there are a number of JAKs that are already on the market, but there are some JAKs that are coming through that are still in clinical trial. And we're interested in potentially seeing which of those JAK stats might be useful for JM. As far as vamorolone, this is what we call a new chemical entity. So this has got no other indication. It's got no market approval yet. It's a completely new drug. And this is going to be we think it's going to be the rock star.
I think we have time for one or two more questions if we have them. All right. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for that informative and exciting presentation and summary. As you know, as Andrew mentioned, there's a number of drugs we did not cover tonight that that we will also be looking at in 2021. He mentioned Dr. Travis Kinder at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. That's a division, if you will, of the NIH that focuses on translational science, essentially taking bench work, sort of the basic research and taking it through the next step of identifying compounds or drugs that would have a potential in a particular disease. We've been funding that project for the last 3 years, actually going into our 4th year right now, and Dr. Kinder has about a dozen drugs, mostly existing drugs already approved for other indications, but a couple of new compounds as well, that would appear to be excellent candidates for juvenile myositis. Some even better than the Baricitinib, that possibly better, that is the clinical trial we're running now, but they're a good year to 18 months behind where we are with Baricitinib, and so we would be hoping to move, perhaps one or two of those candidates to the next phase here in 2021 and 2022, so we can continue to look at this pipeline of what will be most effective among our candidate drugs. Also, another thing that Andrew mentioned is, because this disease, presents itself so differently among children and patients, we do believe that we will find many instances where where one drug works better than another in one child, but exactly the opposite in another child. So really coming up with with more than the 3 candidates that Andrew spoke about today is also a major longer term initiative for us as we in the next couple of years focus quite heavily on Baricitinib and vamorolone in some ways. Hopefully being something of a holy grail for our children. Let me also just take a moment and thank all of you who either gave to or participated in the holiday challenge. We are extremely close to our $700,000 stretch goal. We started this campaign with a $650,000 goal, funds that we needed to raise for our research, including this particular project or projects that Andrew's been talking about, through December 31st. And I'm just very happy to report that that we have made that original goal, and I think in all likelihood will exceed our $700,000 stretch goal by December 31st. So I see many familiar faces and names of many of you who participated in the holiday challenge, or in the Grandparents Challenge, which also launched somewhat earlier than the holiday challenge and is also going through a second phase of fundraising here in the month of December. Let me just say and echo what Simonetta talked about a little bit earlier about our grandparent organization. and the kinds of things that that we hope that all of you will help us accomplish as a group of committed grandparents, focusing on moving our research forward. You all have really just been extraordinary. When you add together a couple of significant gifts, such as the Coffee Family Challenge that really drove the success of the Holiday Challenge for us this year and in previous years as well. Grandparents are giving in total, believe it or not, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Cure JM's, overall operating budget in the course of any given year. So I just want you to know how important, all of you are and our grandparents from coast to coast toward in our success. We're going to need you at our side more than ever as we go into these clinical trials. Our budget, which is in healthy shape right now, I'm happy to report that while we have about $1.7 million in grant commitments outstanding right now. We also have about $2 million in the bank. So we're in pretty good financial shape in terms of our ability to meet existing and anticipated future grant commitments. That said, these clinical trials that Andrew has been talking about are significantly more expensive than the kind of basic research that we typically have funded in the past. So this vamorolone trial, we think will probably cost, it's a small academic trial, but it will probably cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million on the low side and maybe $2 or $2.5 million on the high side, over and above what we're already funding. So I'll just kind of leave you with that commercial. So and appreciate all that you have done to continue to fuel our progress moving forward. We're very confident in our ability to not only see these drugs through to a positive conclusion for JM kids, but we're also very confident that with your help and with the help of thousands of parents and other generous donors that you've helped bring into this Cure JM family over the past several years, that I have no doubt that we'll raise the money that we need for these trials. So thank you for being with us tonight. Again, I'm deeply appreciative of all you have done for us. And if any of you have any additional follow-up questions for Andrew or for me, we're easy to reach at Cure JM, andrew.heaton@curejm.org or james.minow @curejm.org. And you can find us, anytime you need to. We'll be happy to get right back to you. Simonetta, anything you want to wrap up on closing remarks? We've got a couple minutes left.
I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight. We are planning to have monthly grandparent town halls on important topics. And we are so grateful to Andrew for giving us a summary of the medical symposium and breaking it down so that we can understand, and also explaining how it affects our kids directly and our families, even with the insurance, getting this drug approved so that the insurance will also approve, and that's helpful to our families. So, and thanks everyone for supporting Cure JM, especially this end of year campaign with the Holiday Challenge. I appreciate that so much because it really does make the differences, such as Dr. Heaton explains. And if anybody has any other questions or if I can ever be of any help, please feel free to contact me anytime. My email address is in the chat, as well as Dr. Heaton's, and I'm gonna put in Jim's right now. So thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.